In March of 2022, I drove out to New Jersey to visit an old friend who'd just moved near Morristown. We used to explore weird places back in college. Abandoned buildings, drain tunnels, ghost towns. It had been years since we did anything like that, but one night after dinner we got to talking and decided to check out an abandoned hospital we'd heard about years ago. Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. Most of the main complex had been demolished back in 2015, but locals said one of the older auxiliary wards, Ward G, still stood deep in the woods, untouched and sealed off. We couldn't find any official mention of it, but there were blurry photos on forums and a few cryptic posts claiming it had never been part of the official blueprints. It was the kind of thing we used to chase for fun. The next day, we packed flashlights, gloves, and a crowbar, just in case. It took nearly an hour hiking through thick brush and old service roads before we found the structure. It was low and wide, maybe 2 stories, half swallowed by vines and trees. The windows were bricked up or shattered, and rust streaked down from the roof like the building itself had been bleeding for decades. The front doors were chained, but there was a side entrance through a collapsed wall that led into what looked like a hallway. The air inside was heavy and still, filled with that unmistakable scent of mold, wet concrete, and something else, like metal left in blood. We moved slowly, checking every corner, every sound. At first, it was just what we expected. Peeling paint, old gurneys tipped over, a broken intercom system. The walls were covered in graffiti, but some of it was strange. Symbols, tally marks, crude drawings of faces with hollow eyes. There were no signs of squatters, no fresh trash or signs of life. It felt forgotten. We made our way down the main corridor, passing old patient rooms with rusted bed frames and shredded curtains. Then we came to a door unlike the others, metal, reinforced and bolted shut with an old security keypad next to it. The words above it were barely legible. Ward G. We didn't expect it to open. But when I brushed the dust from the keypad, the green light blinked once, then clicked. No code entered, no power source in sight. The door groaned open an inch, just enough for us to pull it wider. Inside was a pitch-black hallway with tile walls and a slight downward slope. The temperature dropped instantly. I remember that detail so clearly. How cold it was, like the air had never been touched by sunlight. We moved deeper inside, our flashlights barely cutting through the dark. The hallway split into multiple rooms, patient cells, storage closets, what looked like a nursing station. Everything was more preserved here. Less vandalism, like no one had ever made it past that door. In one of the rooms, we found something that stopped us cold. A journal, bound in leather, old and warped. It was filled with handwritten notes, dates from the early 1970s. The entries were frantic, repetitive. One phrase kept showing up: "He walks between the lights." That was the first moment I felt something watching us, not the kind of fear you talk yourself out of, a deep, cold certainty. We both stopped speaking, just kept walking, hoping to find an exit on the other side. That's when the lights overhead, long dead fluorescent strips, flickered on, one by one. Down the hall behind us. We didn't wait. We ran, not toward the light, but deeper, hoping there was another way out. The path twisted, the rooms became smaller, tighter. One was lined entirely with mirrors, but none of them showed our reflections. I don't know how that's possible. We stood in front of them, but the glass showed only empty space. I reached out to touch one, and my hand passed through. That's when I heard the breathing, not ours, from inside the mirror. A deep inhale, ragged and slow, right behind the glass. Then a smear appeared across the surface, like condensation from a mouth. We turned and ran again, losing all sense of direction. The hallways looped, spiraled. I started seeing the same door over and over. Room 117, always room 117. We'd pass it, turn a corner, and it would be there again. My friend started panicking, slamming doors, trying to smash windows that didn't break. Then he stopped, just froze. At the end of the hallway, something stepped into view. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape. It was like the air itself had folded wrong. A silhouette, but made of shadow that shimmered, like heat off asphalt. It didn't walk. It glided forward. The lights began flickering again, this time in front of us. We were being herded. I grabbed my friend and pulled him toward one of the supply closets. We slammed the door, held it shut. The air felt thick, like we were breathing through water. For what felt like hours, we waited, but nothing came. Eventually, the lights died again and silence returned. When we stepped back out, the hallway was different. It looked newer, lit by daylight, clean. The doors were gone. just smooth white walls and a single sign that read, "Exit." We didn't question it. We followed it, and when we stepped through, we were standing back at the original entrance. The sidewall we'd come through was sealed. No hole, no sign we'd ever been inside. We made our way back to the car in silence. That night I tried to find any mention of Ward G. It doesn't exist. Not in public records, not in old maps. I even contacted a local historical society. They said there was no additional structure left behind after the demolition, but I still have the journal. And on the last page, written in the same frantic hand, is something I didn't notice until days later. It says, "The exit is never the same twice." In July of 2020, just as lockdowns were easing in most places, my cousin invited me to come visit him in Colorado. He was living in Pueblo, and we hadn't seen each other in years. We were both into urbex, urban exploration, and with things quiet due to the pandemic, we figured it was the perfect time to scout locations people had been too cautious to touch lately. He brought up Ridgeway Medical Center, a long-shuttered hospital that had closed in the late 80s after years of budget cuts, legal issues, and a suspicious fire that damaged part of its west wing. Officially, the city had condemned it and boarded it up, but we found multiple ways in posted online from recent explorers. There were rumors of tunnels underneath, sub-basement levels that weren't on the original blueprints. That's what drew us. We parked a few streets away around 6 p.m. and made our way in through a collapsed back wall. The place was massive, 5 stories tall, with entire wings reduced to rotting frames and others that felt frozen in time. Dusty wheelchairs, operating lights that still dangled from ceilings, filing cabinets overturned like someone had rushed out mid-evacuation. But what stood out most was how silent the place was. We heard nothing. Not even the sound of wind through the broken windows. No birds, no rats. Just the echo of our own boots crunching across broken tiles. After 2 hours of exploring, we found a stairwell behind a locked maintenance door on the east side. The lock had rusted through. At the bottom was a landing and a heavy steel door, half covered in hazard tape so faded you could barely read the words. My cousin pushed it open with effort, revealing a short hallway and a set of elevator doors, both sealed shut. But next to them was a narrow service corridor leading deeper underground, sloping downward. It wasn't on any layout we'd seen, and the walls were older, concrete with embedded ceramic tiles that looked like they hadn't been touched since the 50s. He flicked on his brighter flashlight, and we followed the path in near total silence. That's when the air changed. It wasn't just colder, it was still, not just quiet, but vacuum-like. My ears popped, like we'd dropped in elevation too quickly. The corridor widened into a room that had clearly once been used for storage. Empty shelves lined the walls, but in the middle stood a metal gurney, and on it something covered in a rotting sheet. We both stopped. Neither of us spoke. He reached out slowly and lifted the edge of the sheet. There was nothing underneath. No body, no bones, just a massive black stain that soaked through the sheet and stained the gurney beneath. It wasn't blood, it was too dark, almost reflective, like oil, and it smelled sharp, metallic, but not decayed. That was the first time I felt we weren't alone. Behind us, something clicked, not a footstep. More like the sound of a latch snapping shut. We turned, but no one was there. Just the hallway we came through. But the door we had entered from was closed. We hadn't touched it. My cousin went back and tugged. It didn't budge. We started to get that sick realization. We weren't in control of how we'd leave. Deeper in the room, we found another door, this one already open, leading into a chamber with old analog machines. EKGs, surgical lights, even what looked like a primitive MRI unit. The room had no windows, only a clock on the far wall. It wasn't running, but the second we stepped in, it ticked once, then again, and then the second hand started spinning faster and faster until it blurred. Suddenly everything electronic powered on at once. The monitors lit up with static, a defibrillator screeched to life, and the surgical light above us flickered on so violently it cast multiple shadows, some of which didn't match our movements. I swear I saw one of our shadows standing completely still when we both moved. We ran. We didn't care what we knocked over, what noise we made, we just wanted out. But the hallway changed. What was a straight corridor before now had bends, doors we hadn't seen, dead ends that hadn't been there. We picked a door and pushed through, and found ourselves back in the main hospital building, only It wasn't the same anymore. The walls were intact. The paint looked new. There were fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. We were standing in what looked like an active hospital hallway. But it was silent, no patients, no staff, just the sterile glow of a place in use with no people. We walked carefully, unsure if we'd somehow found a sealed-off floor. Then from behind one of the doors we heard it. A heartbeat monitor beeping steadily. We pushed it open, expecting to find someone, a squatter, a patient, anything. But the room was empty, just a bed with straps, a single light hanging overhead, and a mirror on the wall. Only in the mirror we weren't alone. There were two figures standing behind us, both of them wearing surgical masks, dressed in outdated scrubs stained with something dark. Their faces didn't move, their eyes didn't blink. We turned around, nothing, turned back to the mirror. They were closer. That's when we ran again. No direction, just panic. We found a stairwell and bolted up it blindly, not stopping until we saw daylight through a shattered window on the 3rd floor. We jumped out onto a loading dock and didn't look back. Once we caught our breath outside, we tried to find the entrance again to see if we could make sense of what happened. But the corridor we took to the sub-basement was gone, just a solid wall of rusted pipes and concrete. No door, no keypad, not even damage where it should have been. A week later, my cousin developed a ringing in his ears that hasn't gone away since. He says it gets worse at night, especially around 3 a.m., which is exactly when we first entered the sub-basement. I haven't gone inside another abandoned building since, but I can still see those figures in the mirror closer every time I blink. Back in November of 2018, I was working as a freelance photographer for a publication that focused on forgotten places across the Midwest. That month, I was assigned to shoot Pines Sanitarium, an old tuberculosis hospital tucked into the hills outside Asheville, North Carolina. It had been abandoned since the 1960s and was known locally for its history of patient mistreatment, strange disappearances, and unethical experimentation during the peak of the TB crisis. I'd seen plenty of decayed buildings in my time, but there was something about Red Pines that even the locals didn't want to talk about. Every person I asked just told me not to go alone, but I did anyway. I arrived at dawn, parked on a cracked lot overrun with weeds, and entered through what had once been the patient reception hall. The air inside was icy, much colder than outside, and the moment I stepped through the broken doors, my camera glitched. Not broke, not dead, just off. The battery was full, but the screen wouldn't respond. I told myself it was the cold. I took out my backup. The building itself was 4 stories with long, curving hallways that mirrored the style of early 20th century institutions. Sunlight spilled through shattered windows, casting broken shadows across the moldy tile floors. Wheelchairs sat in corners. Beds still had restraints tied to the frames, but none of that scared me. What scared me was how intact the place felt, not preserved, just stuck. Like time had paused, but never moved forward again. I wandered room to room, taking photos, making notes until I found the central elevator shaft. It was an old mechanical lift with manual sliding doors, something you'd expect in a building from the 1930s. Rust had eaten away at the bottom, and there were faded red stains along the frame. The power was long gone, but oddly the call button panel was lit. A dim green light on the bottom floor indicator glowed faintly. I didn't press it, I wasn't stupid. I took a few shots, stepped back and started to head for the main stairs to explore the upper floors when I heard a loud ding behind me. I turned and the elevator doors slid open. No sound, just motion. Inside, the elevator was clean, too clean. The walls weren't rusted, the floor was polished, there was no dust, like it had just been installed. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, shining my flashlight inside. My beam hit the mirrored back wall, and my reflection didn't match me. It looked like me, but its head was tilted slightly, too far. Its eyes were open wider than mine, and it didn't blink when I did. I backed away, and the doors began to close on their own. The ding echoed again, this time from a floor above. I waited, frozen in place, as the elevator began rising, floor by floor, the sound of each ding getting closer. It stopped at the 3rd floor. I should have left then. Instead, I followed the staircase up slowly, half expecting to hear footsteps or voices, but the air remained dead. When I reached the 3rd floor landing, the elevator was open again, empty, nothing inside, but the hallway lights were on, not flickering, fully lit. Each door was labeled as if the hospital was still in operation. Exam room A, Patient ward 3C observation, but none of the rooms were accessible. Their knobs had no give, like they weren't meant to be opened, except one. Room 314, the door was ajar. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. It was a patient room, smaller than the others, with one metal frame bed bolted to the floor and leather straps hanging from the sides. In the corner was a single black and white photograph in a cracked frame sitting on a table that hadn't collected any dust. The photo showed the room I was in. Same bed, same walls. But there was someone lying on the bed, completely still, their face blurred out. Standing beside them were two men in white coats, smiling at the camera with faces too distorted to recognize. My stomach turned. I snapped a picture of it. Then the lights went out. All of them. In one breath, the building swallowed itself in blackness. I tried my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't respond. I stepped back into the hall, heart pounding, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw something impossible. Every door down the hallway was open, wide open, and from each one a figure stood, motionless, dressed in faded patient gowns, faces lost in shadow. Not one of them moved, not even to breathe. The ding came again. The elevator was open, glowing like a beacon. I didn't question it. I ran toward it, squeezing past the unmoving figures, my footsteps echoing like gunshots. I dove into the elevator and hit the ground floor button, even though I knew there was no power. The doors closed, and the elevator moved, but not down. It went up, higher than the top floor. There was no floor counter anymore. Just a ringing in my ears and a pressure in my chest, like I was ascending past the building's limits. Then it stopped. The doors opened to a hallway I'd never seen before. The air was warmer, fresher, and I could hear voices, real, living voices. I stepped out into a clean hospital hallway, modern, bright, sterile. A nurse brushed past me without looking. A doctor followed, clipboard in hand. No one acknowledged me. I called out, but no sound came from my mouth. I tried again, nothing. I looked down. I was wearing a hospital gown. Straps dangled from my wrists. I ran to a nearby room, found a mirror, and my face wasn't mine. It was the man from the photo, the one strapped to the bed, the one without a face. Then everything snapped to black. I woke up in the woods just outside Red Pines. My camera was beside me. The time on my watch said 3 hours had passed, but it felt like days. Every photo on my memory card was corrupted, except one, room 314, empty. But now someone stands beside the bed, wearing my clothes. If these abandoned hospital stories made your skin crawl, imagine what still lingers behind those locked doors. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because the next story might be one you've lived.